Good morning. Today we're going to talk about French and English opera. This is lecture 10. But before we start with that, I'd like to begin by saying a few words about Italian opera seria. Italian opera was not only very popular within Italy, but its popularity had spread across Europe and into France and England. So why was it so popular? Well, first of all, it was the combination of art forms. Where else could you have art and literature and drama and dance and music and scenery and set designs and architecture along with orchestra music all in one place? Not only that, but the operas developed into very elaborate stage productions. So we're talking about fire on stage and weights and pulleys in a system where it would look like gods were ascending to heaven or descending to earth. So it was really popular. And there was no place more elaborate than France, especially under the reign of Louis XIV, who reigned for a very long time between 1643 and 1715. So the earliest French operas were really not so much operas at all, but rather kind of a narrative interspersed with dances and songs. It had its counterpart in England as well. In France, they were called ballets de cour or court ballets. Now, dance was a very important part. Dance has been an important part of French history for a very long time. The subject matter usually was courtly love or adventure, but most important, it was that there were allegories or stories that would highlight the king and glorify the king. Kings at this time, in all sorts of operas, were equated with gods. Kings saw themselves as gods, as magnanimous beings, as all-powerful. And so the idea of an opera frequently, or at least the story within one, was to show the glory and the majesty and the wealth and the power of the king and the king's estate. In fact, in France, Louis XIV became known as the Sun King, similar to Apollo. And that was sort of his representation, was as the sun, someone who looked down upon everyone and shone his glory upon his subjects. So when we see with French opera, rather, was not only a bit of take off from the Italians in terms of what will develop as recitative and aria, but we see real French traits as well that really stem from dance. For example, dance-like rhythms, or the use of dotted rhythms, especially majestic, and changing meters. And the one person who is really responsible primarily for the French style of opera was Lully.
Giovanni Battista Lully was born in Italy in 1632. He learned to dance, play the violin, and compose. And as a 13-year-old, he was taken to the court of Louis XIV, likely by the Duke of Guise, who wished Lully to teach his niece Italian. Lully gave the Duchess of Montpensier, as she was known, Italian lessons and played in her string ensemble. Unfortunately, according to Britannica.com, he was, quote, dismissed for having composed some scurrilous verses and music. Not one to shrink away from a setback, in about 1652, Lully went to work as a court violinist for Louis XIV himself, who was only 6 years younger than the composer. Within the next 10 years, he was composing dance music and music for the Cour de Ballet, the court ballets, and even became the music master to the royal family. More than anything, Lully wanted to be French, and in 1661, when Louis XIV was crowned king, Lully was granted French citizenship. He changed his name to Jean-Baptiste Lully, as he is known today. While in service to the king, Lully collaborated with the French playwright, actor, and poet Molière, and together they created 9 comedy ballets between 1664 and 1670. As stated in francemusique.fr, quote, not only did these works enable 2 great geniuses of the 17th century to work together, but they also enabled the composer to insert sung and danced melodies into the narrative. In addition, Lully deployed all vocal styles and experimented with sung recitatives. Lully was highly ambitious and over the course of time became as close to the king as he could get. After acquiring the patents for opera production, by 1674, no opera could be played anywhere in France without permission. Lully was the one who decided which operas would and which operas would not be performed. Lully was the most powerful musician in France. Lully is credited with establishing both a new style of opera as well as the French overture. New dances were included in his ballets, women were included on the stage, and he called his operas tragedies set to music, or lyric tragedies, in French, tragédie lyrique. As quoted in francemusique.fr, drawing upon his best work in each genre, Lully brought a regal quality to the recitative, which went beyond the simple sung declamation and merged with the aria to form a fluid whole. The composer also employed popular ballet scenes and used props and stage design to a great dramatic effect. So in other words, not only were the productions very elaborate, but he used more dancing, more choruses, an accompanied recitative. And here's what France Musique was talking about. There was less difference between Lully's aria and recitative than there had been in the Italian style of opera seria. So in other words, there was a continuity that occurred between aria and recitative to sort of blur the lines. The way that Lully set the text was according to the language itself. There was rhythmic freedom and therefore changing meters. We'll come back to the French overture in a second, but meanwhile, one of the things that would be really interesting to watch is the excerpt that is below from Le Roi Danse, which is a movie made about Lully and the king. And in this excerpt, you will see what the elaborate stage design was like, even though this is really from an early ballet de corps. So pause the video and enjoy this excerpt from Le Roi Danse. I hope you enjoyed it. Now let's look at the French overture. Lully is credited with establishing this style. The French overture is basically in two sections. The first section is slow and the second section is fast. Here we can see in the Comédie Overture Georges Dandin that there are two sections. The first section is a slow section with dotted rhythms. The dotted rhythms make for a very majestic opening. The second section, which is fast, begins with an imitated motive. This is very characteristic of the second section. They always start with imitation. So the French overture then has two sections, the slow dotted and the faster with the imitation. You can see that this overture is very short, so we have the A section repeated and then the B section repeated. So pause the video and play Overture Georges Dandin and listen to a French-style overture as characterized by Lully. One last thing about Lully. In 1687, he was pounding the beat down for the orchestra when he pounded the stick right down into his foot. The stick went through his foot and became infected. Because Lully was a dancer, he didn't want his leg to be amputated, and so gangrene set in and Lully died.
England, too, had its own operas. However, it took a while for it to develop. Like France and the Ballet de Corps, England had its own style at the beginning that was a predecessor of opera. These were called masques, M-A-S-Q-U-E-S, and it wasn't really an opera so much as it was a series of events that occurred within perhaps a narrative or a storyline, a general storyline. There were vocal pieces, instrumental music interspersed with poetry, and dance and even pantomime. I'll include a link below to show you a bit of a spoof on English masques. Anyway, the masque was very popular among the aristocracy. They usually were held during banquets or after banquets, and it was popular, as I said, between about 1603 or so and 1649. Now, there were no real operas or stage plays between 1649 and 1660, and this is because stage plays were forbidden by the Puritans. And when Oliver Cromwell took the reins, he banned any kind of stage plays. Why, might you ask? Because he said that theater was invented by the devil. There was drunkenness and prostitution, you see, at the back of the theaters. According to bardstage.org, the Globe Theatre in London attracted huge crowds, up to 3,000 people. The theaters were also used for bear baiting, gambling, and for immoral purpose. It appealed to young people, and many apprentices were said to have been lured to the theaters instead of working. The crowds attracted thieves, gamblers, pickpockets, beggars, prostitutes, and all kinds of rogues. So you can see why under Oliver Cromwell this would be banned. However, there was a loophole. Concerts were okay. This is between 1653 and 1658. Concerts were plays set to music, also called semi-operas. They had solo songs, ensembles, choruses, instrumental pieces, and spoken dialogue, which was the most important part. But real opera in England didn't come about until Henry Purcell.
After Oliver Cromwell was defeated and the Restoration occurred, which was the restoring of England's monarchy, the first great English opera was written by Henry Purcell. Now, there had been other English operas, John Blow's Venus and Adonis, for example, but the opera by Purcell was really what put England on the map. Purcell was born in 1659, lived until 1695, and he worked for the court of Charles II from 1660 to 1685, and then James II from 1685 to 1688, and finally for William and Mary, who outlived Purcell. William and Mary reigned from 1688 to 1702. Purcell was a singer and an organist and a composer for the monarchs. Purcell wrote in a European tradition, but also included an English style with traits of his own. He wrote odes, religious anthems, instrumental music, songs, and one opera. You can see here that those English style elements included a lively instrumental style. It included English folk-like melodies, but at the same time, it also brought in from Europe the recitative and aria of the Italian opera seria. This is what helped to put England on the map, because it needed to have the traditional style, or what was so popular through the continent, but with an English twist. Purcell also used the dotted and accented rhythms of French opera. His opera, Dido and Aeneas, was written in 1688 for presentation at Josiah Priest's Girls' School in London. It was based on Virgil's Aeneid, and the librettist was Nahum Tate. Basically, this whole opera had to be appropriate for a girls' school. So not only was it only about an hour in length, but it had quick character development, a lot of choral singing and dancing, although the parts were really for very few amateurs and used economical resources. And it was also had to be teaching something. It was moralizing, giving the girls something to think about. At the same time, it might also have been political. I'll talk about that in a minute. Meanwhile, I'd like to tell you the story. This is an excerpt from Virgil's Aeneid, Book 4, and then recreated by Nahum Tate. The basic story goes like this. After the fall of Troy, Aeneas and his men are shipwrecked at Carthage. Their job is to go and found Rome. Queen Dido and Aeneas fall in love. But Aeneas, through trickery by witches and a sorceress who hate Dido, is made to believe that the gods are sending him to complete his voyage. He must obey the gods, but he doesn't want to leave. He tells Dido that he must leave. She doesn't want him to leave. He's wishy-washy. He goes back and forth, and he says, maybe I don't have to leave. But Dido, in the end, is the one who realizes that Aeneas must go and complete his voyage and follow the orders of the gods. Aeneas leaves, and Dido dies. Now, this is a little bit different from the original Aeneid story. First of all, there were no witches and sorceresses in the original story, but rather the gods themselves. Another part that's different is that instead of just dying of grief, Dido ends up committing suicide by hopping upon a funeral pyre and basically lighting herself on fire, which is the way that Aeneas finds his way out of the harbor, by this burning funeral pyre. It's pretty awful. But as you can imagine, because it's written to be presented at the girls' school, some things have to change a little bit. So here we have a 1-hour show with a moralizing idea. So the problems with illicit love. Dido and Aeneas were not supposed to fall in love. They did anyway. And therefore, the consequence for that is for them to be split up. But it's also moralizing in that Dido is a strong woman. And of course, Dido can't die the way she had to die in the Aeneid. And so there was a little bit different, and she just dies of grief. It's still death, however. Anyway, politically, what has happened is that William and Mary have come over by sea from Orange, and they have taken the throne. Now they're Protestant after a series of Catholic monarchs. So was Purcell trying to get in their good graces? Not so sure, but it could be. So if that's the case, then the political aspect would be, like Aeneas, William came by sea, and instead of having the gods there, the witches, which were replacing the gods, could have represented the allegedly plotting Jesuits against the Protestants. Either way, it was a wonderful opera, and it showed the rest of Europe what England could do. The most famous and the best part of the work is really Dido's lament, as we can see here. And this is the last part that Dido has, and she has sent Aeneas off to go found Rome with his men, and she turns to her handmaiden and she says that she's basically going to die. Notice that the recitative is very much like the recitative that we've seen in Italian opera, but here we have more accompaniment. So it's at the height of the drama, and therefore we have an accompagnato accompaniment. Then look at what happens next. The basso continuo, particularly in the cellos, begin the descending line. Remember that descending lines signify sorrow, and you can't get more descending than a series of chromatic pitches. This descending line repeats. It is the ground base upon which all of the music is written. And we can see that it continues all the way to the end, at which time we have a ritornello, a little refrain that kind of harkens back to the very opening. So listen to Dido's Lament by Purcell and enjoy the ground bass in one of the most famous pieces from England of this time period. I will see you next time, and have a great week.